Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bill Purcell. I'm the Senior Associate Director at the Center for Social Concerns, so thanks for being here this afternoon in this cold day. And I'm excited to introduce Dr. Suzanne Mary Mulligan this afternoon. Let's begin with a short prayer, especially since she's speaking on homeless. Let's have a prayer for poor people in our community. God of justice, open our eyes to see you in the face of the poor. Open our ears to hear you in the cries of the exploited. Open our mouths to defend you in the public squares, as well as in private deeds. Remind us that what we do to the least ones, we do to you. Amen. So both globally and locally, access to affordable and safe housing is becoming more difficult, raising serious questions about economics, social inclusion, and the common good. So how might Catholic social teaching contribute to such a discussion? And what does the Irish context reveal about the challenges of accessing decent housing and safeguarding human dignity? In order to answer those questions, we've invited Dr. Suzanne Mary Mulligan here to speak with us. So Dr. Mulligan is theology faculty and director of programs at the Pontifical University in Maynooth, Ireland, in County Kildare. Suzanne Mulligan is a graduate herself of the Pontifical University in Maynooth. She was a lecturer in moral theology at Milltown Institute in Dublin until 2011, before being appointed as faculty of theology at Maynooth. She has held the Finley Postdoctoral Fellowship in Theology at Milltown Institute, and at Maynooth, she was Director of Higher Diploma in Theological Studies. She is currently coordinator of the Masters in Contemporary Ethics at the Pontifical University. Dr. Mulligan is a member of the Planning Committee as the European representative for the Catholic Theological Ethics and the World Church. She is also a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Moral Theology. Just so you know that, again, this event is sponsored by the Center for Social Concerns, but I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors this afternoon, which is the Nunavik Institute for European Studies, so thanks Monica and Clements. Thank the Keogh Naughton Institute for Irish Studies, as well as the Department of Theology. Thanks to Matavina, the chair, who is joining us here. So let's please welcome Dr. Suzanne Mary Mulligan.
Thanks, Bill, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. I appreciate that the weather is not terrific, so I do appreciate you all being here. On Monday morning, I went to morning prayer at the Center for Social Concerns, and morning prayer began with a short poem by Mary Oliver, and I was very struck by it, and I think I might just begin today's lecture with that same poem. It's entitled Praying. It doesn't have to be the blue iris. It could be weeds in a vacant lot or a few small stones. Just pay attention, then patch a few words together, and don't try to make them elaborate. This isn't a contest, but the doorway into thanks and a silence in which another voice may speak. My lecture this afternoon is, I suppose, my effort to patch a few modest words together on the topic of housing, homelessness, and Catholic social teaching. And they probably won't be very elaborate, but I hope they will provide a doorway into a space for other people to ask some questions towards the end, because I'm conscious of the fact that there are people here who probably know more about this than I. But the housing crisis in Ireland has become a topic of much conversation, both among academics and among ordinary people who are really just trying to get by day to day. So it has, I suppose, as a topic, come onto my agenda, and I've started to think about it theologically. And that's the starting point, if you like, for me. I'm not speaking as somebody who works extensively on the ground in the area of homelessness. I'm thinking of this more theologically and more through the lens of Catholic social teaching. So let's begin. In his recent book, The Tyranny of Merit, What's Become of the Common Good, Michael Sandel critiques the commonly held belief that those at the top of society are there on merit. They have earned their place, or so the argument goes, while those who have lost out are somehow responsible for their lot in life. If they had worked harder or drank less, invested more wisely, were more intelligent, they too would bear the fruits of their efforts. Sandel is not convinced, and like Pope Francis, does not believe that open market economics alone will solve the many forms of inequality now so prevalent across our world. Instead of prioritizing greater market freedom, Sandel argues that tackling inequality ought to be government's primary goal. He says, and I quote, "Mobility can no longer compensate for inequality. Any serious response to the gap between rich and poor must reckon directly with inequalities of power and wealth, rather than rest content with the project of helping people scramble up a ladder whose rungs grow further and further apart." End of quote. We see these same sentiments expressed in Pope Francis's third encyclical letter, Fratelli Tutti. Francis explains that although some economic policies have enhanced growth generally, they've not promoted integral human development in a consistent or inclusive way. While wealth has increased for some, inequality continues to rise. As a result, new forms of poverty are emerging. And Pope Francis tells us, and I quote, "Poverty must always be understood and gauged in the context of the actual opportunities available in each concrete historical period." Fratelli Tutti 21. The Holy Father's examination of poverty and inequality in Fratelli Tutti recognizes the inherently structural problems that are at the core. In other words, how our social and economic structures exclude many from opportunities of work, housing, access to healthcare, and so on. But he goes further. We have become blinded, in a sense, to the inequalities around us. Pope Francis is mindful of the ways in which sinful structures and a cultural sense of cultural privilege deadens or damages our moral sensibilities to the point where we don't even see the suffering of those around us. In Evangelii Gaudium, he states, "Changing structures without generating new convictions and attitudes will only ensure those same structures will become, sooner or later, corrupt, oppressive, and ineffectual." Inequality reveals itself in a myriad of ways, but in Ireland we see inequality of opportunity, as Pope Francis puts it, revealed most vividly through our current housing crisis. The right to housing is becoming an increasingly precarious and often unattainable thing for many. Some fear that before much longer, if not already, the right to housing will be something enjoyed only by those who have significant levels of wealth in Ireland. Describing housing as a human right is not without its difficulties, but we are becoming more aware of the need to afford this right legal and economic protections. We know that it is critical to the realization of many other rights and is crucial for the protection and promotion of the dignity of the person. Irish theologian Ethna Regan acknowledges that this appeal to human dignity is normatively thin, as she puts it. But she says that such a basis is nonetheless important, constituting potentiality for agreement about human rights across differences of faith and culture. So I wish to do three things here in my talk this afternoon. First, I will outline the parameters of the homeless crisis in Ireland, with modest reference to the global context also. Second, I'd like to examine how Catholic social doctrine might help us to understand and respond to this crisis. And particular reference here will be made to the Irish Bishops' Conference, who in 2018 issued a pastoral letter on the housing crisis in Ireland. And third, I wish to briefly consider how we might enrich our moral discourse on this topic, how we might develop a more engaging moral rhetoric, if you like. And with this in mind, I'm going to turn to concepts such as vulnerability, fragility, and solidarity. So to our first task then, the homeless crisis and the housing crisis in Ireland. The Irish have had a complicated relationship with housing and with land ownership, especially in our recent history. The Great Irish Famine, as it's referred to, which took place between 1845 and approximately 1852 in Ireland, dispossessed many people of land and of housing. The majority of people in Ireland at this time were living in extreme poverty. Many, in fact, didn't have any official dwellings. We know that approximately 1 million people died during the famine, and somewhere between 1 and 2 million people emigrated in the immediate aftermath of the Irish famine. And of course, for the better part of 150 years since that event, Irish people have been leaving Ireland in their tens of thousands. The Irish Free State, and later the Irish Republic, has a mixed record when it comes to the provision of housing. Partly because of the famine, we find the emergence of tenements across the major cities of Ireland, primarily Dublin. At the turn of the 20th century, Ireland was the British Empire's second city, and it housed the largest slums in Europe. Approximately 26,000 families lived in Dublin's tenements. 20,000 of those families lived in single-room dwellings. So, for example, in the 1911 census, we know that at number 7 Henrietta Street, which is in Dublin's inner city, 19 families lived in one house. It was a total of 104 people. And there was no running water, and there was no indoor toilet facilities. This is typical of the period. And these slums lasted right up until the 1960s in Dublin. Partly because some of these dwellings started to collapse, governments were put under pressure to do something in terms of social housing for the poor. And we do find, to be fair, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, quite a considerable amount of investment placed into social housing. Some of this is not without its problems, and we don't need to get into that at the moment. But the point that I'm getting at here is that up until very recently, housing was a reality for most people in Ireland. Until a generation ago, a family with a single income, even if it is a very modest income, could legitimately expect to own their own home. So where are we now? During the Celtic Tiger years, we see that the Irish government ceases to prioritize investment in social housing, and the expectation now turns to private ownership. But the financial crash of 2008 brought the property boom in Ireland to a halt, and it created many, many problems for the Irish economy. We are now emerging from that recession, and we know that property prices in Ireland today have returned, and in fact increased in some cases, from their pre-crash levels. This is partly due to a huge strain on the housing market in Ireland. Fewer properties are available to rent and to buy, and supply is not keeping up with demand. First-time buyers are finding it harder to get mortgages or to find properties that are in fact on the open market. And so they're finding it they're finding themselves increasingly forced to stay in rented accommodation long term. Because rents are rising, homelessness in Ireland has taken on a new face. And this is very recent, this is very new to the Irish context. Although what we sometimes call traditional homelessness was always part of the Irish scene, homelessness is now taking on the face of families, including single and double income families, who can't afford to rent anywhere and can't afford to buy. So what are the figures? According to the Department of Housing and Local Government, approximately 8,500 people in Ireland are classified as homeless as of September 2021. Now, this may not seem like a particularly excessive figure, and I did Google what homeless figures were for New York and Chicago and Boston, and obviously they're in the tens of thousands. But the Irish population has only hit 5 million recently, last December I think it was. This is the first time since the famine that the Irish population has reached the 5 million mark. So there aren't very many of us, and when you think of it against that context and you read the figures, understanding that, this is a bigger problem than it might first seem on paper. Not included in that figure are people who are couch surfing, people who are in prison or in hospital, people residing in domestic violence shelters, and so on. The figure does include almost 2,500 children and 3,500 young adults under the age of 24. There are almost 800 families in Ireland who are homeless as of September 21. This is down from a peak, however, in 2018 of almost 1,500 families. We also have the reality of direct provision centres around Ireland. And these were centres that were set up by the government initially to try to house migrants and refugees who are coming to Ireland. There are approximately 7,500 people in direct provision centres, 30% of whom are children. These centres are completely inadequate as regards the housing conditions that these people are in, and they don't cater for the emotional, psychological, educational, cultural, or religious requirements that many of our refugees and immigrants need. So is this just a question of supply and demand? The Irish Taoiseach recently suggested that it was. He suggested that once you increase the stock, you solve the housing crisis. But is it this simple? Supply is certainly a key part of the problem in Ireland. We know, for example, that spending on social housing was cut by 72% between 2008 and 2012. The government is now trying to address this shortfall in social housing, and it's playing catch-up with demand. We also know that the construction of private homes fell dramatically between 2008 and 2012 as the construction industry basically collapsed in Ireland. However, to think about homelessness only in terms of a lack of supply is, I would argue, ignoring the complexity of this problem. For one thing, we now have the presence of vulture or cuckoo funds, as they're called, on the Irish property landscape. And again, this is something that is very new to Ireland. Increasing supply alone will not necessarily allow greater access to the housing market for private citizens. In Dublin's Docklands, rental income for a two-bedroom apartment is €3,300 approximately. And so these vulture funds are looking for more and more property to buy because they can see the very high returns that they will get on their investments, far higher than leaving your money in the bank or investing in other commodities. So increasing supply, therefore, without adequate legal protections for private buyers, could allow large companies who are in a position to buy for cash unfair and disproportionate access to the market. This will likely result in more people being forced to remain in rented accommodation for longer, and fewer properties becoming available for purchase by private individuals. So without economic and legal protections, one would have to ask to what extent increasing supply in the current situation is likely to alleviate the problem. The global reality also tells us that this situation is likely to get worse before it gets better. Access to housing is becoming an enormous global challenge. There are many reasons for this, but included are the rising costs that are pushing house prices beyond the affordability of average or low-income individuals, global population growth, and a migrant and refugee crisis that is being exacerbated by war, economic destitution, and climate change. In 2005, the UN estimated that there were approximately 100 million homeless people worldwide. Today, that estimate has risen to approximately 150 million people. This represents 2% of the global population. However, we know that approximately 1.6 billion people, more than 20% of the population, are lacking adequate housing. It seems obvious to say, therefore, that the world's housing crisis is likely to worsen as population growth continues upon its current rapid trajectory, unless there is radical, real, and immediate global political intervention in this area. Moreover, migration is likely to heighten pressure on housing into the future. According to the UN Refugee Agency, at least 82.4 million people around the world have been forced to flee their homes. Among them are nearly 26.4 million refugees, half of whom are under the age of 18. Global homelessness, therefore, is often driven by multiple socio-economic, political, cultural, health, and climatic factors. War and climate change remain key variables contributing to the forced displacement of people, both internally and cross-border around our world. And as we know, this in turn is contributing to a rising anti-immigrant sentiment in many parts of our world, and the rise of populist groups in some cases also. So it's one problem feeding into another, you might say. So that's just a little bit of the context of where Ireland is at, and also, I suppose, some of the figures that illuminate what's happening globally. The second part of my talk considers what Catholic social teaching might add to this discussion around homelessness. If this is the reality and if these are the figures, what is it that the social tradition and the Catholic moral tradition more generally can lend to public discourse on this topic? From its infancy, we know that the Christian faith has recognized the call to play a positive, transformative role in the world. For centuries, women and men of goodwill have found themselves at the front line in times of crisis, inspired by the gospel message to care for and accompany the most vulnerable in society. The social mission of the Church and her commitment to what we today call social justice has always been an integral part of the Christian faith, even if we have not always carried that out as consistently or as effectively as we should have. We know that the Christian faith also teaches that all human beings are made in God's image. The Imago Dei confers on humans an innate dignity. This human dignity is universal. It is not based on merit, racial grouping, economic status, gender, sexual orientation, or religious affiliation. An important moment in both the life of the Church and the social doctrine itself occurs during the Pontificate of John the 23rd and later the Second Vatican Council. For we now saw the full embrace of human rights in magisterial teaching. Documents such as Pacem in Terris, Gaudium et Spes, and Dignitatis Humanae were arguably three of the most significant documents of that era. And if we add Pope Paul VI's encyclical Populorum Progressio onto this list, where he deals with the conditions that provide for integral human development, we find a corpus of teaching that outlines the Christian understanding of human dignity, corresponding rights, and the socioeconomic context in which humans might flourish. We're all probably very familiar with the now famous definition of the common good that we encounter in Gaudium et Spes, where the Council Fathers describe it as the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. That's Gaudium et Spes 26. But if you read further down that paragraph, you'll find the following. There is a growing awareness, the Council Fathers tell us, of the sublime dignity of the human person who stands above all things and whose rights and duties are universal and inviolable. She ought, therefore, to have ready access to all that is necessary for living a genuinely human life. For example, food, clothing, housing, the right to freely choose her state of life and set up a family, the right to education, work, to proper knowledge, and rightful freedom even in matters of religion. This to me is a very positive statement. The Council Fathers are not describing the minimal requirements necessary for social living or the basic needs upon which human survival is dependent. They are concerned instead with human flourishing. They're concerned with authentic living. They are concerned with imagining the conditions in which people can live their best lives, realize their potential, and discover their gifts. They are concerned with the conditions that can allow God's glory to shine through in our lives. And this suggests that social, economic, and political structures exist to facilitate human flourishing, to protect people's dignity, and are at the service of the common good. So what is it that the Irish bishops say, drawing from this social teaching context, from this canvas, if you like? What is it that the Irish bishops have to say to the housing crisis in Ireland, and how do they utilize this body of teaching to critique it? In response to Ireland's housing crisis, the Bishops' Conference published a pastoral letter in 2018, as I mentioned. In it, they make many important contributions to the current debate. They reiterate the role that government plays in protecting the common good. They insist that housing is not just a commodity, but is crucial for human flourishing. They warn against seeing property only as a way of maximizing profit. And they insist that the economy is meant to serve the person and the common good and promote human dignity. The bishops insist that safe, affordable, and appropriate housing is a human right and not a commodity, and that the provision of housing, therefore, cannot be left solely to market forces. Housing is fundamental to our well-being, and as such, it plays a pivotal part in our flourishing. To continue with this point, Ethna Regan argues, and I quote, "The contemporary challenge of social, global, and ecological justice makes the Church's continued promotion of human rights, especially the rights of the poorest of the poor, an urgent imperative. Within this imperative, the situation of the homeless poor needs to be treated as a violation of the right to housing, a violation that merits the same attention as that given to torture and executions." And like what the Irish bishops have said, William T. Kavanagh rejects the notion that the free market, left to its own devices, will somehow miraculously rectify any imbalances in the housing sector. He says, "There are those who are opposed in principle to any government provision of goods that the market should provide. But such voices do not get much credence from those who advocate for the homeless, nor should they. The idea that the market will provide, if left alone, is one of the most pernicious forms of magical thinking that afflicts the contemporary world, and one that is refuted by thousands of people sleeping rough on our streets. So if housing is a human right, as the Irish bishops insist, we must develop a new way of thinking and a new attitude around the provision of housing. And a key step in that regard, certainly within the Irish context, is a move away from thinking of housing just as a commodity. We all, myself included, got a little bit sort of caught up in this idea. We were all going to become millionaires by investing in property, right? And that's kind of the main way it was understood and talked about by and large. So I think a new way of seeing it is critical in this regard. We can draw an important parallel here between what the Irish bishops are saying and what the broader social tradition has said in the past on a number of things, primarily in terms of what it has said in terms of labor and the rights of workers. We now insist that labor is not a commodity, something that can be bought and sold on the market. We have grasped for many decades that labor is at the heart of human dignity, and the dignity of work lies in the fact that it is a person performing a task. Can we not make a similar claim with housing? Like labor, houses are not commodities, vulnerable to the workings of the free market. Housing is an integral part of our being. It's an integral part of our being able also to live dignified lives, and therefore deserves appropriate protections. Again, just to quote the bishops, they make this very forcefully in their pastoral letter when they say, commitment to people who are enduring homelessness or inadequate or unaffordable housing is not an optional extra bolted on to the life of the Christian. Rather, such a commitment is an inescapable consequence of accepting God's commitment to humanity. The bishops also recognize that governments have for too long prioritized the short-term economic gains of the housing market rather than prioritizing longer-term social goals. And again, within the Irish context, we were very guilty of this. The making of enormous profits through speculation in land and housing and maintaining high rents is particularly damaging to society, they tell us. And we must all work to alleviate to change this toxic situation, as they put it. The bishops call for a very direct role by government in all of this. They call for greater state intervention, and they outline several lines of action, including increasing social housing, greater protections for private renters, and this is a huge problem in Ireland, utilizing empty housing or taxing people who refuse to utilize empty housing or empty property, addressing the needs of accommodation among the traveller community in Ireland and asylum seekers, and addressing energy poverty and enforcing better building standards. So that's a snapshot of some of what they have to say and why. And for the third part of my talk, I wonder if and how we might develop a more robust and a more enriching moral discourse around housing. That's not to say that the more traditional categories that we find in Catholic social teaching and that the bishops utilize are unimportant or irrelevant. But I wonder sometimes, is there a disconnect? We make moral claims all the time within Catholic social teaching and within the Catholic moral tradition more generally. We talk about human dignity and the innate dignity of every person. We talk about it being universal, but we somehow can't connect it to certain issues, or we overlook certain issues and we think it is not perhaps necessarily as relevant to them. So towards some new sort of framework for our discussion on homelessness, I have turned primarily to the work of Jim Keenan and Linda Hogan, both of whom have written about and spoken about extensively the idea of vulnerability and how this connects and might strengthen our sense of solidarity with others. So first, to an ethic of vulnerability. Linda Hogan makes the following claim in something that she wrote recently. She says, mutual dependence, shared vulnerability, these are elements of human existence that have rarely featured in the ways in which politics is constructed or ethical theories are framed. Indeed, much of our politics and ethics seems to be intent on foreclosing this recognition. And yet, shared vulnerability and mutual dependence may be precisely the qualities that have a resonance with the individuals and communities worldwide who are struggling to find the grounds for hope of a shared future in a divided world. Within the Christian tradition, we encounter a God whose ultimate expression of vulnerability, of course, was to take on human form, live among us as a relational being, and in the end, suffer physical and psychological torture. And the God who is raised from the dead returns to us transfigured, certainly, but also remains visibly wounded. He does not return to us as a perfect physical specimen, like what we might encounter in the Greek and the Roman gods of the time, but instead a God who bears his wounds and shows the signs of vulnerability that made him fully human. Keenan argues that our vulnerability should not be seen simply as a negative thing, but rather, he says, and I quote, when we recognize that the word vulnerable does not mean being or having been wounded, but rather means being able to be wounded, then it means being exposed to the other. In this sense, vulnerability is the human condition that allows me to encounter, receive, or respond to the other. There is great risk in all of this, of course, and our vulnerability may expose us to harm and to risk, and to hurt, We are fragile creatures, but such is the human condition. Our vulnerability is essential, or Keenan would say prior, to our being able to respond. And so precarity, or risk and harm, journeys alongside this vulnerability. Keenan goes on to say that learning from the precarious and entering through a humility or a meekness into an accompaniment that can eventually transform us into greater solidarity with others. When I read Keenan's work and others speaking about this, I also think of people like Brian Massingale and Sean Copeland and many other theologians who speak of solidarity in a way that connects solidarity to this shared vulnerability and this relationality that is common to us all. For Massingale, encounter and experience of the vulnerable other is crucial to our developing new ways forward. Now, Massingale is speaking about race and racial injustice, but I think what he's saying is equally applicable to other forms of injustice within society. Christina McRory argues that attentiveness to the other is a crucial practice not just of humility, but also as a way to open ourselves up to God's redemption from worldly distortions, as she puts it, and making ourselves vulnerable to God's grace. Ultimately, we believe that an ethic of vulnerability might offer a new lens through which we can understand the grave challenges of today. It could affect a more meaningful response, and it might generate a deeper solidarity and connectedness with vulnerable people among us. I would argue that an ethic of vulnerability provides us with a new way of seeing and acting. and one that should find a natural place among the followers of a God whose vulnerability was laid bare through exile, displacement, and ultimately through bodily fragility as he hanged from a cross. In conclusion, thinking about housing merely as a commodity might be part of the problem that's leading us towards the injustices that we're seeing in society. We're seeing the emergence of large portions of populations who are at risk of homelessness or who are having to live in substandard accommodation. Catholic social doctrine provides one resource that might help us examine and respond to the injustice of homelessness more fully. Christian anthropology, rooted in an understanding of the person as imago Dei, offers a vision of the human person that is deeply relational, social, and indeed vulnerable. And in so doing, acts as a counterweight to excessively individualistic interpretations of human rights. This is more important than ever as we witness growing inequality in Irish society and beyond. Discourse that includes an ethic of vulnerability, one that encompasses our collective fragility, our collective woundedness, might provide an additional lens through which we can appreciate the injustice of homelessness and respond to it more meaningfully and with much deeper solidarity. I'll finish with the words of Cardinal Supich on this idea of solidarity, who himself is, I suppose, developing what he calls a consistent ethic of solidarity, a relatively new idea building on Cardinal Bernardin's idea of a consistent ethic of life. Cardinal Supich says, "An ethic of solidarity offers a language and a vision reminding us of who we are as a nation, but also what it means to live together in this common home." I think that, along with an ethic of vulnerability, provides us with a rich language and a rich way into considering a whole host of injustices, including the housing crisis that we're currently facing. Thank you.
We have a couple of microphones, so if we have 15 minutes for any questions that folks might have for Dr. Mulligan. Sure. Clemens? Oh, Mark Fox and then Clemens.
So thanks very much for sharing that really powerful paper with us. I would suggest that the magnitude of the housing crisis in St. Joseph County, our local community, is comparable to what you've described in Ireland. And I want to invite your reflections on the ways in which the injustices are perhaps magnified in the U.S. context, because healthcare is not viewed as a fundamental human right. And so the challenge of unmet healthcare needs and the inequities experienced, particularly in the realm of mental health and substance use disorders and things that, create a vicious cycle. Yep. I would just invite you to extend your reflection to include that in your commentary.
Yeah, thanks very much for that comment. You're absolutely right, and I deliberately didn't get into issues of mental health and addiction and so on, partly because I'm not an expert on those issues, although, as I said, I know people who do work in that area. But you're right in what you're saying. It can become this vicious circle. And I know that here in the US, access to healthcare is a huge issue, a political issue. And as you say, housing is likely to be sort of on that agenda, on that kind of platform as well. I suppose what I would say, maybe in response to it, is similar to what Pope Francis has appealed to us all, not to become, as he calls it, single-issue Catholics. And we talk about being pro-life. And one of the things that Cardinal Bernardin, in his idea of a consistent ethic of life, tried to do was to broaden that horizon. And I think Supich and others, are trying to sort of carry on that conversation, if you like. And for me, that's critical. We have to get away from thinking of the sanctity of life as applying only to the unborn. And we have to recognize that we have responsibilities to those around us for the entirety of their lives, So it doesn't seem to add up to me to say that you believe in an ethic of life if you don't believe in things like access to healthcare, access to adequate housing, access to education, food security, all of these kinds of realities, because we can't live dignified lives without access to those. Not all in equal measure, but we certainly need the opportunity to gain access to these things. So I think I think there needs to be more honest, moral discourse around this, a more inclusive moral discourse. And part of that is recognizing what, the social tradition is trying to prioritize and trying to promote, because it has for too long been seen as kind of the poor relative within Catholic moral theology. Okay, I never studied Catholic social teaching as a student. It wasn't on the curriculum. So we have to get away from thinking in those narrow, almost exclusive terms, and starting to appreciate the complexity of being human, the fundamental relationality and mutuality that comes with that, and all of the issues around psychology and, as you say, disability, mental health, all of these things that are so important to that. If you don't have those supports in place, we're missing something.
Yeah, I think Mark's question and your answer killed one of my questions, in a good sense.
That's good.
Because we think alike. Because I was thinking of a project in Salzburg where people thought you solved the housing problem for the homeless people by giving them housing. That's a good start, but it doesn't solve the problem, because there's not only the spatial justice issue, there's also the epistemic justice issue, because living in a house and maintaining a house, you need certain skills and certain levels of security and safety, and not too much chaos in your life. So they realize they have to have a social worker, and they have to have some pedagogical element accompanying the housing project that they try to pull off. But I think you answered that. Another question I would have is, and maybe I can ask two. One is, what's the role of the church as a real estate owner in Ireland? Because at least in Austria, the church owns a lot of property. But now with the decreasing funds coming into the church, they need to invest so that they have return on investment and contribute to the gentrification of some areas by converting their property into apartments for sale. So that's one question, the role of the church. And the third and last question is, do you think that the category displacement may be useful? Trying to make sense of what's happening here with homeless people, because the category place is such an important and also emotionally charged category. And I thought a bit about the category of displacement, and for me that would be a helpful category to think about homelessness and the housing issue.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thanks for that, Clemens. Just on the first point just to carry that on, you're absolutely right. It isn't just about providing a house in the sense of a physical space for someone to live, albeit that's crucial and that is an important first step. It's about having support structures perhaps in place. It's about having access to educational facilities, parks and recreation. It's also about building our houses in the right places so that existing communities aren't fragmented even more. And I referred to the Dublin tenements and how from the 60s on, basically, Dublin's poor were taken out of these tenements and put somewhere else. They didn't want to go anywhere else. They were really unhappy at being moved out into suburbs and into high-rise, flats. And because they had a community, they knew their neighbors. They could walk everywhere. Then they're out in the suburbs and there's no transport links, so they're isolated. So you need to have a lot of planning and a lot of vision for how we can do this well, including, as you say, support structures, particularly if we're dealing with populations that may have had in the past addiction problems or mental health issues. But also, I'm thinking in Ireland in relation to direct provision centres that I mentioned. For the most part, it's not true in every case, but for the most part, many of the refugees and migrants that we are taking in are coming from violent contexts. They're fleeing violence or they're fleeing war, and they've witnessed the horrors that humans can do to each other, right? And in particular, children have witnessed a lot of this. There are some kids leaving Syria who were born into a war and have only ever known war. So you need to have a lot of support structures in place to be able to, as you say, not just house people, but make sure they can integrate into communities and they can belong to a place properly. Your second point about the role of the church and real estate in Ireland, they've had to sell off a lot of their real estate because of the clerical abuse scandals and compensation to victims of sexual and physical abuse. They still own a lot of property, for sure, and recently the housing minister in Ireland appealed to the Irish bishops to give over church land for the building of social housing. And I'm not opposed to that, but I'm sort of wondering, is he trying to get off the hook by appealing to the church to go and say, well, okay, well, you're talking about this, you go and do more. I think the church could do more, but I don't think that should detract from the government responsibility either. And on the third question of displacement, I think that's a really good point. I think it's a very useful category, if you like. We talk about migrants and refugees, but displacement, we can be displaced for all sorts of reasons. And if you think of the United States, just to confine our discussions to this locality, I think we're going to see, or you're probably already seeing, urban displacement, urban refugees in some cases, and you are going to start to see more climate refugees internally, okay? People from other parts of the United States who just can't live there any longer because of wildfires, because of flooding, whatever it might be. So displacement is a really helpful, I think, category in helping us to understand the scale of the problem and the kind of fragility, if you like, that's involved in this question.
Okay, I need a mic.
You're on camera, Dave.
Thanks for the talk. So, a question about the ethic of vulnerability as a way towards, or a mechanism towards, increasing solidarity. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about whether this ethic of vulnerability would be more useful to think of in terms of what we might say horizontal solidarity amongst groups that we might identify as commonly exploited and underprivileged and yet not in alliance with each other, or more in terms of vertical relationships like employer-employee, the wealthy and the poor. It seems to me at least, especially in the United States, there's so much ability just to refuse to process what's right in front of one's eyes, the compartmentalization of reality, so that you just, don't assume responsibility for what's happening right in front of you. And I wonder about that ethic of vulnerability and thinking about class and power. So, Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I suppose that it's an idea that I'm still trying to figure out in my own head, right? So I'm at sort of the beginnings of trying to discern the extent of its usefulness as an idea, but there's something about it that I find very appealing. And I think it can go either way. I think it can become, as you say, a vertical or indeed a horizontal sort of resource, if you like. I don't think it's either or. I think there's the potential for it to be useful in either scenario. So with those kind of power structures that you mentioned, but also horizontally in terms of the groups that are right beside us, that we share our communities with and our society with, that we don't even see. I suppose the reason I like this idea of an ethic of vulnerability is that it points to this very common human characteristic, okay? We don't like to think of ourselves as being vulnerable, but we are, and I suppose we have to face that in a whole different kind of number of ways in different occasions, and it's there in front of us at times in our lives. And I just wondered whether it gives us something more fundamentally human, a way in to recognizing the other as common, as the same as myself, in some very fundamental way. And that will transcend religious discourse and political discourse and so on. It may not, but there's a cultural bias, for want of a better way of putting it, that we all can share, if you like, whether it's to do with gender, whether it's to do with political affiliation, class, economics, whatever it is. But there's a problem at times where, as you said, we can't see the problem that's right in front of us, or the group that's right in front of us. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan all over again. Why is it that some people walk past and others stop? And is there a way for us to try to break down that kind of cultural bias or cultural blindness that can often exist? And, we can talk about it as Christians, coming from our understanding of our God and our relationality and so on. But I just wonder, does vulnerability give us an extra kind of language or an extra kind of discourse that might help open up these questions and allow us to identify things as being essential and critical that we might not otherwise have seen? But I'm very much at the beginnings of trying to figure this out myself. Yeah.
One last question.
Thank you. I was just wondering if there are particular, like from my perspective as the librarian who tries to collect this, are there particular agencies in Ireland, like the Vincent de Paul, whose reports and so on I should be collecting? Like, who is advocating, who is promoting this justice and help for homelessness and the changes that are needed? Thank you.
Just writing some down here because I'll forget. Yeah, I mean, there are a number of places you can go for the kind of the state, government, secular, if you like, side of things in terms of reports and data, various agencies to do with housing and so on. But I guess the things that I probably tend to deviate more to are the kind of faith-based publications and resources that are out there. And Focus Ireland is a good place to go, and they sometimes have really good reports and articles that are written up, or the Peter McVerry Trust does a lot of good work on that. But I think probably one of the most useful places that I tend to go to is the Center for Justice and Peace, the Jesuit Center for Justice and Peace, I think it's called. And they publish what are called working notes, and they're really great, and it's on a whole range of things. It might be on homelessness, it might be on work and working conditions in Ireland. It could be on any number of things. But that tends to be very up to date, very on the ball. It's a nice balance between not being very academic, but being informative, factual, objective. And if you look up their working notes, I find them excellent.
Wow, talking about perfectly on time. So again, we're so happy that we could have Dr. Suzanne Mary Mulligan to come all the way here from Maynooth, Ireland, to show us what it really means to be Irish when we talk about Irish here, but to give us perspective, especially on social inclusion, economics, and the common good in that perspective of collecting, especially looking at CST as a lens to do that, and getting a global perspective with that. So if you can give me, let's give her a warm, thank you.